Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to this event, a conversation with Dakota Mace, held in conjunction with our exhibition, Dakota Mace, Diné Bé Iiná, the Diné Lifeway, running through June 25th. Dakota Mace is an interdisciplinary artist whose work focuses on translating the language of Diné history and beliefs. Her work explores the themes of Diné family lineage, community, and identity, and pushes the viewer's understanding of Diné culture through alternative photography techniques, weaving, beadwork, and papermaking. Dakota received her MA and MFA degrees in photography and textile design at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her BFA in photography from the Institute of American Indian Arts. She has also worked with numerous institutions and programs to develop dialogue on the issues of cultural appropriation and the importance of Indigenous design work. Excuse me. She is currently a grad advisor in painting and drawing at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and photographer for the Helen Louise Allen Textile Center and the Center of Design and Material Culture, Madison, Wisconsin. Dakota's work as an artist and scholar has been exhibited nationally and internationally at various conferences, collectives, museums, and galleries. Her work is currently on exhibit at the Kemper Museum of Art and will be shown in upcoming exhibitions at the Lincoln Art Institute, Chicago, the Cedarburg Art Museum, and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And now I'm pleased to introduce you all to Dakota Mace, who we thank for joining us today. Just a reminder, should you have any questions, please type them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bruce. I will start the presentation now. So again, thank you so much for inviting me today to speak a little bit more about my work, but to also hear a little bit in terms of what inspired me as an artist. And the show, which is titled Diné Bé Iiná, roughly translates to the Diné Lifeway. So the different ways that we are connected to one another, but also how often our artwork and our processes and our knowledge are kind of blended into one. And this is something that's been a big inspiration for my work for many years. So to start off a little more briefly, my artistic research very early on explored Diné traditions and history through the relationship to memory and land. A lot of our Diné beliefs are built upon different types of narratives and symbols that teach us Hajon, which translates to balance or balance within ourselves. So within Diné culture, there's this beautiful symmetry of everything existing within fours. So 4 sacred mountains, 4 cardinal directions, and 4 sacred colors. And this was something that stood out to me very early on. And one motif that really stood out of everything that I was researching was Diné Bé Iiná, which translates to Spider Woman. And this is the motif with the 4 points that you see on the screen. So the importance of the land that's often understood for Diné people is that it relies on a grid to kind of weave a sacred intersection of threads that connect the Diné people through the materials and this concept of 4. So through my work, I explore the past, the present, and the future with forms that are inspired by the land. So the materials that I use, which are both traditional and non-traditional, are connected to the places that they reside, the memories that they hold, and the complexities that they share with our lineage. So Diné Bé Iiná, Spider Woman, taught us the way of weaving, and it's one of the most important deities for the Diné and one of the most prevalent motifs that is used in my work. She was one of the first to weave her web of the universe while spreading the beauty way teachings of balance within the mind, the body, and the soul. So this narrative really formulated an understanding of the certain aspects of the Diné creation story, as well as bringing Spider Woman into the fine art world. So for my first series, I wanted to explore Diné traditions through the use of color. Within our creation, stories are represented by the different worlds that are represented by the colors that come from our land. So for myself, the color blue referenced the second world and the connected stories, which are often very complex and subtle. For this work, I wanted to be able to bring Spider Woman into the processes that were most important to me. This included many alternative photography processes, such as cyanotypes and chemigrams. What stood out to me about these processes was the connection the photographer makes to the materials used and the importance of contact with the print itself. These pieces in particular are in dedication to Spider-Woman, with the solid blue referencing back to the color that is important to our creation story. The cyanotypes were then beaded with glass seed beads and that is actually used in many Indigenous communities today. The beadwork is essential to the process because it's an object that still holds significance to the trade history for many cultures. Beading is also another meditative process, but very much like weaving and photography, where I allow the work to create itself and the beads to outline the importance of the Spider-Woman motif. Each cyanotype is painstakingly beaded, taking 10 to 15 hours each to bead one of these designs. Something important within my work was Diné weaving, and especially looking at how Diné weaving is more than technique and craftsmanship. It is a connection to the Diné concept of hajon, which is balance within nature. My weavings for the series, We Weave What We See, focused on reinterpreting the symbolic abstractions of our creation stories, our cosmologies, and our social structures, while using a combination of European weaving drafts and looms, as well as utilizing Diné weaving practices within the work itself. The weaving themselves were created to mimic the cross motif often used in Diné weavings to reference the four directions. For me, the ability to bring these processes together was a chance to expand my weaving knowledge further and connect with the process even more. Weaving within my family has been a recent discovery for myself as I learned more about the community I come from and the importance of our traditions. I learned to weave later on in my life, but for my ancestors, it informed the connection I made before me and translated to the deeper meaning behind Diné weavings. Within each weaving is a hidden narrative and is represented by every bead. It speaks to weaving for Diné people, my family, and myself. The abstract approach to my work gives my audience a window into the world of the Diné, introducing the importance of colors referenced within our stories and the memory of our designs and weavings. For the Diné people, understanding the desert landscape is seen as an abstraction of the hidden narratives that reference these creation stories. The practice of weaving is integrated into every aspect of Diné life and speaks to the importance of translating spirituality in connection with self-reflection. Weaving can be seen as a form of meditation, as it's more than a continuous repetition of warp and weft. It is a connection to the materials and surroundings. And this provides that window into understanding our identity that can be hidden within each thread and bound to the piece itself. The role of Diné weavers was to be inspired by our surroundings and our landscape, which led to the beautiful history of Diné weaving itself. Many will argue that the concept of weaving came to the Diné people through trade, but it was an opportunity to expand their creative endeavors. This led to connecting to certain aspects of culture and scope of textiles by continuously enhancing it through the innovation of style and experimentation. There is a poetic understanding of our weavings and designs and the importance of the sacred ideologies woven into each piece, which has a quiet voice that resonates deep within the object. The weaving is more than a pattern between warp and weft. It serves as a reminder of the importance of tradition and the belief of we weave what we see. What's important to the Diné is looking at not only our homeland as an inspiration, but also the landscape that we come from. To share a quote by Lucy Tapahoso, the land that may appear arid and forlorn to the newcomer is full of stories which hold the spirits of the people, those who have lived here today, and those who have lived centuries and other worlds ago. The Diné homeland holds the memory and narratives of their Diné ancestors within the land itself. To unfold these narratives, we must listen with all of our senses and the place that surrounds us. The horizon and the land are never separate entities. They always meet in the distance when the dawn brings the white light of the morning and the dusk brings the dark colors of the night. This piece in particular references the topography of New Mexico and abstracts the landscape with the colors of the beads. For myself, much of my work speaks to my relationship to New Mexico, the ancestral home of my family and community. It is a place that holds many stories and where many of my pieces are created from. As a child, I would often look at the canyons and the mesas, memorized by the textures, and watch how the light dramatically changed the landscape. Each bead was placed one by one to show the passing of time and the meditative qualities that the landscape gives. The horizon is the essence of the Diné homeland, and through those minimalized lines and the period between daylight and darkness. This is a line into understanding my Diné identity through the material presence of my work, as well as this window to land, memory, and culture that is situated in this place. This body of work is an abstraction of land. What is depicted is the essence of the power within land itself, to be united with the Diné homeland and what it means to be Diné. Through this version, I recall the relationship as well as this important connection to the sacred, a representation of my ancestors through symbolic design elements. These symbols are spider woman, mountain, whirling log, and four, which are inherently embedded within the land while also constantly shifting. The chemigram process itself is unique within the world of photography. It relies on abandoning everything you know about the traditional photography process and takes an abstract and painterly approach to create an image. For myself, this process is one that I was drawn to immediately due to its unique nature. What stood out was the ability to make a print that was one of a kind, never to be the same, yet hold the body's movement within it. While in the dark room, I used a combination of materials to create each print, and each required the whole body to produce different abstractions. This reminded me of the New Mexico landscape and how the land changes its narrative through light. For the Diné, our ancestors live within the land itself, and the designs featured within our textiles, pottery, and silver jewelry. We are connected to our ancestors and those memories embedded with the land through these abstracted designs. These designs have been passed down from one generation to the next, and especially through my family, it is passed through silversmithing. My current work I am developing is titled Bishlagayb, which translates to silver, which focuses on the stories of silversmithing, the importance of design, and the influence of land. This started my interest in kind of expanding further into utilizing alt processes within my work. And this series, titled Lachi, or also Red, is dedicated to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. Their stories continue to exist within the landscape and impact our relationship with these sacred places. Through their memories, may we never forget who they were: mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts, nieces, and daughters. Creating this work started with listening to the stories of those families who had gone missing or who were murdered. With each story, the importance was placed on the memories of those individuals and the places that held significance for them. As a result, a more profound appreciation for these individuals' strengths inspired me to reflect on what it means to be connected to the land. Each piece was dedicated to these stories, places that hold the memories or the abstractions of their home. The work was also created to be eventually placed back into the earth. The original works have slowly deteriorated over time, with the emulsion slowly peeling and separating, while the dye takes over the entire image. I intended to see this work as an extension of those who are no longer with us, a chance to live through the work and slowly go home, becoming one with the landscape. As an artist and someone who works in the museum field, this went against everything I learned in terms of preservation, but it was also a starting point for me to see my work past its material presence. Through the stories of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, and looking at our shared histories, I realized the significance of creating work that has a timeline. Like my ancestors, our stories eventually go back into the land to be shared and honored. This work was what inspired my later series titled Sacred Places, and looking at the significance of oral narratives and photography. This body of work is titled Tuo. So the title of the series is Tuo Ine, which translates to water is life, which is an essential aspect for all Indigenous people. It encompasses the importance of nature and recognizing Indigenous people as the original caretakers of the land that they reside on. Water is an essential part of understanding the land and preserving the history and the memory it carries. Nothing can exist without water, and many Indigenous communities today still struggle for access to water. This series focused on understanding the changes that are happening with the waterways here in the United States and the many Indigenous people who continue to fight for its protection. This work was created in the lake surrounding Madison, Wisconsin, which is my current home. As an artist, my work has always been informed by my home in New Mexico, a place that holds deep significance for me. Although I live away from my home, Madison has become my second home, a place I have slowly learned about the stories and the materials connected to the Native communities surrounding Wisconsin. Each print was made to show the damage done to these lakes, as well as the surrounding nature. Current situations such as the Enbridge Energy Line 3 oil pipeline and access to clean water for over 30 tribes in the Southwest are just a few examples of the ongoing fight to protect water and land. Today, water is still an essential part for many Indigenous practices, and respect is needed for what it continues to provide for all. Each piece is a dedication to our ancestors, the land we reside on, and the memories that exist within. The vastness of Diné homeland is again rich with narratives that exist within the landscape. The Diné hold a close relationship to our home, and each area has sacred significance or places of stories. The Diné visit these places to connect to our ancestors and to connect with the powers to the land. Through these interrelated places, we never forget that we exist within a larger story, one that is part of a much larger living system that includes the water, the earth, the canyons, and the plants. It is through these Dahotiana, these sacred places, that healing can begin. The series explores the long walk that my Diné ancestors took in 1864 when they were forcibly removed at gunpoint by the US government. During the 18-day march to Bosque Redondo, also known as Fort Sumner, thousands perished from hunger and violence and were unable to return to their home. The project honors the importance of land and natural materials. It is believed that in order to understand the Diné, you must place yourself into the world of Diné tradition. Art is essential to our beliefs and is a lifeline to our culture, land, and the histories that are part of our identity. With each connection, tradition remains central to the fundamental understanding of the Diné, a line between one generation to the next. I created a small-scale cyanotype prints of abstracted locations seen as sacred for the Diné along the route to Bosque Redondo. I allowed the landscape to create the photograph, letting the earth and its materials create abstract forms of the memories that it holds. Each cyanotype is made to remember my ancestors who went unnamed or unrecognized, and their identity embedded within the land itself. Huedi, also known as Bosque Redondo, is a site that was the final stop in what was known as the Long Walk for the Diné, a painful removal of my ancestors from their homelands by the US government. Huedi is the Diné name for Fort Sumner, located in central New Mexico and pictured on the left. On the right is a cyanotype made on the grounds of Fort Sumner. It is a place of extreme hardship where many of my Diné ancestors were imprisoned from 1864 to 1868. It is estimated that 2,000 Diné died walking this route. While creating this project, it was during the time when COVID became the second most significant loss of Diné life, and the long walk being the first. Unlike the lives lost to COVID, many of the individuals who died on the long walk are only represented by numbers. Today, the fort is a tourist destination, though it remains a place of deep sorrow for the Diné. The exhibits there tell the story of how the US Army used scorched earth policies to forcibly remove the Diné people from their homelands to this inhospitable location. I take an indigenized approach to storytelling, collapsing the past, the present, and the future. While the long walk happened to Whitty more than 100 years ago, it is still with us, and we must remember what happened. This moment in our history defined a new era of sovereignty, one of resilience and survival, and reminds us of the struggles for the rights of our land, natural resources, and freedom. I asked each person I interviewed to select a memory, an object, or a landscape which has become a place of healing, a sacred place. Chester Otero is a Diné elder from Torreon, New Mexico. He is my great uncle and my grandmother's older brother. The sacred memory he chose to offer was the only photograph he has of his mother. The cyanotype was made utilizing medicinal plants used in Diné ceremonial practices. Chester was born into ceremony, where he received his Diné name, an essential part of a Diné child's upbringing. The name carries on the memories of his mother and the long lineage of Diné women before her. Within Diné culture, our identity and kinship are passed down from our mothers. We introduce ourselves by our mother's clan, and we as children take their family name. Diné women are the center of the family, and they are the keepers of our ancestral teachings. This is Elsa Otero. She was born in 1948 in Torreon, New Mexico. This photograph of Elsa at a residential boarding school is a scan of a scan with her name written on it in ballpoint pen. The quality of the image contradicts how precious it is, since it is the only photograph of herself as a child. In the background are cyanotypes created near Elsa's home, where details like those in the photo have been layered and obscured. The deterioration of this piece represents the US government's repeated attempts to eliminate Diné ways of life through residential boarding schools, Christian missionaries, and forced assimilation. This is Joe Mace, a Diné elder from Ojo Encino, New Mexico. He is my grandfather and was the main Diné translator for this project. Today, he is still deeply connected to the community surrounding Torreon, New Mexico, and works to provide outreach for Diné youth on their culture and identity. This piece represents my grandfather's childhood, one of hardship and continued survival. The spoon on the right is a remnant of his childhood home, a place that today is controlled by the Bureau of Land Management. On the left is the only existing photograph of Joe as a young man. It was taken in front of Fort Wingate, the residential boarding school he attended for 4 years. Fort Wingate is notorious for being the starting point for the forced removal of the Diné during the long walk to Bosque Redondo. This led to the loss of culture, language, and the historical trauma that still affects many Diné people today. Herbert Lewis is from Rincon Marcos, New Mexico, close to Torreon, New Mexico. He was born in 1935, and Herbert's mother told him he was born in McKinley County, but didn't know the exact location due to lack of records. Herbert wasn't officially recognized by the US until later on in his life. He was treated as if he was an immigrant on his ancestral land. For this project, we spoke in Navajo. However, he felt more comfortable writing in English and wanted to write his story down as his contribution for a sacred object. He shared his biography, the story of his birth and early life in chapter 1, with the hopes that his children who don't speak Navajo could read it. This is another piece made by Herbert Lewis's memories. He was married to his wife, Ruth, for 59 years before her death in 2018. She often looked out the window at this tree in the New Mexico landscape of their yard. The cyanotype was made from the earth near this exact location, and the deep cochineal red signifies the importance of this color to Diné people. It is a color used in our medicines and used to protect those who are traveling. While on the long walk, many Diné would seek shelter under juniper trees like the one pictured here and share stories beneath them. These stories were often prayers offered to lives lost. Helen Nez is an elder from Blue Gap, Arizona, which is situated in the center of Navajo Nation. She was born in 1938 and is related to me by my maternal clan, Red House. On the left, the cyanotype features wildflowers naturally growing near her home, one of the few natural plants that have survived in that area, which has been mined for uranium since 1944. Yet much like the flower, Helen continues to persevere, and each one of the flowers represents one of Helen's 11 children who died from exposure to uranium. Diné women are taught that they are sacred. Through her hands, she carries her children, picks traditional plants, tends to livestock, and practices ceremonies. You can see her history etched within her hands and her silver jewelry, a true matriarch preserving her culture and her homeland and protecting her family. Louise Badoni was born in 1943 in Blue Gap, Arizona. She is also related to me by my maternal clan, Red House. Louise is seated in her yard where she is often surrounded by her children and grandchildren who listen to her stories about the creation of our people, the importance of family, and the continuation of our traditions. For Louise, it is a special time because there are very few Diné children who gather this way anymore. The cyanotypes are created near her home, and the wind created these abstracted images. For us, the land is our record keeper, giving us the knowledge and the strength to carry on our traditions. If you listen closely, you can hear the stories of our ancestors being carried across the land. In this cyanotype, I selected plants and flowers along the route of the long walk that represent the lost stories of our ancestor, stories that were never recorded. Many elders chose not to share their memories, believing that it would create further harm. But despite cultural taboos, there is a need to carry forward these stories of resilience. It wasn't until the passing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978 that my own people were allowed the freedom to practice our ceremonies, collect sacred materials, and visit our sacred sites that have existed long before the birth of the United States. This is just one reminder of how very recently it was that America's Indigenous people were granted the most basic freedom guaranteed by the Constitution. Through the camera, traditionally seen as an oppressive weapon, I challenge the documentation of Indigenous people by decolonizing the violent visual history of colonialism. Through my photography, I provide the opportunity to heal and allow the land and its natural materials to tell our stories. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dakota. That was really amazing, and we really appreciate you opening up and giving us such important insight into your history and the plight of the people and what they have suffered through. If anyone has any questions, please put them into the chat. We'll be happy to relay them. In the meantime, I would like to ask you a question, Dakota. You talk about sacred places. It's this sort of collaborative process between yourself and the subject. Do you find that the process has been cathartic for both the subject and yourself? Because you mentioned that few people want to talk about history, and I wonder if many people are carrying a lot of emotion, feelings, that would be really healthy to express. So once again, I ask, was this a cathartic process?
Yeah, definitely, especially for myself, but also the ability to be able to meet with a lot of my elders and people that come from my community, and to just to have a chance to be able to kind of share these stories, whether those are stories of our ancestors or things that were happening to them at the moment. There oftentimes that was a response that I got, was that no one ever asked them these questions before. And something historically for a lot of Diné people is that we would always gather around our elders, our grandmothers and grandfathers, to share these stories. And that's something that doesn't happen a lot anymore in our families. And I think to be able to give this work a chance to be able to open those doors for those individuals to share these moments and to share these stories that are important to them, but to also to be able to see this work as an extension of themselves, but also for myself an opportunity to heal, to learn about these histories that otherwise would kind of go unknown for the rest of my lifetime and for the future.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions? Dakota, can you talk about where you see the state of things right now? You know, is life improving for people, for Native Americans, or is it continuing to be the same?
I think there's still a lot of challenges that Indigenous people still face today, and I think that's something that a lot of younger Indigenous activists and community members have really pushed for outsiders to understand. And I think there's been a lot more awareness, but also within these communities, there still needs to be action that's happening. And I think there's still a long way before we start to see those changes. But I think for a lot of Indigenous artists, especially like myself, our work becomes an extension of our community and our representation of our identity and culture, and to be able to present it in a way that gives a chance for people to understand us as people a little bit better, I think is really important.
Thank you, Dakota. Christina, do you have a question for Dakota?
Yeah, I guess I feel just through my own research and everything, there's ritualistic practices and Indigenous artistic practices are kind of looked at or viewed in a way as a thing of the past. Would you agree with that, or do you think that's kind of shifting too with this urgency?
No, thank you for asking that, Christina. And I think that's something I think with at least my work that I try to bring to my audience is a better understanding of Diné culture and identity, and seeing that our artwork is an extension of our beliefs and our belief systems and our creation stories and where we come from. And there's so much more intention to our work than a lot of people realize, and especially with our designs. And I think that kind of separation has unfortunately kind of really challenged a lot of people about understanding Indigenous artists and Indigenous artwork, because oftentimes we're seen as monolithic and very static, and people often don't realize that there are still living Indigenous people today that are still creating work about their communities and identity, but to also to be able to really appreciate and understand us as individuals a little bit more through our artwork, but also just seeing up and coming Indigenous artists and scholars kind of being that representation, because 10-20 years ago there wasn't that many Indigenous artists that you can name off the top of your head, but now there's a chance to be able to kind of see that at the forefront.
Thank you, Dakota. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now, some of your future projects?
Definitely. So that's actually something that I touched on briefly. Let's see if I can go back to that slide. Is this series that is titled Soul. And this was something that I wanted to kind of continue, is looking at designs in relationship to Diné culture. And this was something that is part of my upbringing as a Diné woman, is looking at our relationship to silversmithing. And my family has been doing silversmithing for many generations, and it's something that's really important for us. And a lot of our designs have been passed down from one generation to the next. And then this is my current research, is looking at those different types of designs, looking at the way that our memory and our histories are shared within those designs, but to also look at how the stories of our elders are being told through these different designs. So each of these different unique arrangements done by the chemigrams is very similar to how silversmiths approach their work, where it's very abstract and painterly, even though it is a hard material, to be able to kind of creatively look at how that changes in terms of being informed by the texture of the landscape, or looking at it through the lighting process of photography. So for myself, it's just a continuation of looking at the chemigram and exploring it even further with my future body of work, but also allowing the work to speak for itself and including beadwork on top of the designs. So it's an ongoing process and still continuing as we speak.
Dakota, we realize we do have some questions here, so I'm going to run them by you. First question, I'm curious if there is a replication of colors, symbols, and content in contemporary Indigenous art that becomes problematic for other Indigenous artists. This is obviously something that white artists are concerned about, appropriation. How does this work within the Indigenous art community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's something that I definitely approach on with my more academic research, is looking at the appropriation of Indigenous design work. And this is something that kind of goes back to looking at how a lot of our understanding of design and art is approached from a Western understanding. So within Indigenous communities, we see ourselves as one single entity rather than a separate individual. And to be able to use these designs is to be able to say there's that connection to our community and to our culture, but it's also something important for us because it has that universal meaning for all of us. So for Indigenous people, there's this respect that comes to us naturally to use these designs, but also to be able to go back to our community and to be able to say, you know, this is what we are representing ourselves is through our designs, but it's also through these abstractions that it becomes important to be able to see how we tell our stories through our work rather than through written language.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I am fascinated by the range of materials you use in your work and wonder how you decide what material it is you choose to express your ideas.
That's another great question. And that's something that kind of just comes to me as I'm creating. And that's something that I usually do, is that I try to travel back to New Mexico as much as I can, because that's one of my biggest inspirations with my work. And it's there that I'm able to go back to my community and go back to the landscape that I'm very familiar with, and to kind of decide, you know, what are the materials that are essentially speaking to me. And for myself, photography was one of the biggest pushes, but also looking at alternative processes, especially cyanotypes, where it's something that I'm able to bring into the land, where I don't need access to a dark room to be able to create the image. But it's also something really beautiful about contact printing, is that we're able to kind of bring photography into the landscape. And then same with weaving and beadwork. These are very meticulous processes, but what's really beautiful about them is that you're able to travel with them. And I think that's something I really appreciate about all of the materials and processes that I use, is that it allows that natural movement for these materials to follow with me wherever I go.
Okay, question, are there particular artists or photographers who have been an inspiration to you in your work?
Definitely. Kind of name another Diné photographer, Kalea Tisinagini, as well as Will Wilson have been a big influence in terms of my work. Just the way that they've translated our history, but also looking at their own Diné identity. And especially through the process of photography, I think is really unique. And especially when it comes to artists, I think oftentimes they're very informed by other Indigenous artists, but also especially Indigenous women artists, because there isn't as much representation very early on, but to be able to kind of be informed by these other women who are creating and also still fulfilling the role as, you know, mothers and daughters. And there's something really special. And I think one artist who's really made a huge impact on my work has been Diné Bé Iiná, with not only her abstractions, but also the way that she approaches her work. Very similar in terms of understanding her identity through the designs that she uses.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I find the colors that are part of the work very moving. Is there more you can speak to in relation to the importance to the Diné or Indigenous culture overall?
Definitely. So this was something that I initially started in grad school, was that as I was working with the idea of looking at creation stories, I realized that for Diné people, we hold a lot of certain colors that holds a lot of significance for us. And there are 4 colors in particular that reference back to our creation stories in our world. So I wanted to be able to look at one single color and spend time with it for 4 years. So this was something that I had done very early on with the color blue, and being immediately drawn to the cyanotype process and really exploring this idea of what does blue mean for Diné people, its representation within the landscape, but also how that blue can be translated into different meanings and can be created in various ways. So this is an extension of that, where to be able to spend 4 years with one color is something often that many artists aren't given an opportunity or a chance to be able to do. So I've been really honored to be able to explore color theory in a very unique way. So right now, this is something within my work, is exploring the color red, and especially looking at natural dyes and how red is deeply embedded within the New Mexico landscape. And this is something that I also kind of subtly add to my work, is exploring the natural white and the black that comes through with using different photographic processes.
Dakota, on that note, with so stars that you have on the screen right now, can you talk a little bit about the process involved in making this?
Yeah, definitely. So the process of the chemigram, again, is very experimental. So when you go into the dark room, we have our traditional developer, fix and stop and everything. And what was something really important about this process is that it becomes very painterly. So I create the image very similar to how you make a traditional contact print, and then allowing the materials that I collected from New Mexico. So whether that was the water, the plants, or the earth itself, and kind of placing it on top of the print and using a combination of different materials such as like water and vinegar and alcohol to kind of change the reaction on top of the image. And as you apply developer, it creates these very unique one-of-kind prints.
Well, it's an absolutely incredible work, Dakota. I don't see any more questions, so unless anything else pops up, I want to thank you so much for the show, the exhibition, and giving us the honor of showing this work. It's been a real pleasure, and we thank you for speaking today and imparting your knowledge on us. So thank you again, Dakota, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming today.
Bye-bye.